Rocky, does yours say you're in a practice session?
Yeah, it does actually.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to click start the webinar, which will then allow all the attendees in, and it'll move from practice to real.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. I'm just going to give like about maybe 2 to 3 minutes while people stream in, and then we'll go right ahead. Yeah. Okay, so let's start. Welcome everyone to the third in TJC's series of webinars as part of this year's World Day Against the Death Penalty. And our series is titled Putting the Death Penalty on Trial. And the aim of the series we have this year, both our webinars and our in-person events, is to really flip the script on the death penalty to scrutinize the use of kind of state murder, the justifications the government gives for it, and to kind of like really kind of examine the death penalty, where, you know, the death penalty and the government who seeks to justify it is the accused, and, you know, the people, the public, are the judges and jury. So my name is Rocky. I'm a member of TJC. And in today's trial, we're very glad to have a special expert witness with us, Dr. Mai Sato. I'm going to introduce Mai now. So Dr. Mai Sato is Associate Professor at Monash University and a Fellow of Eleos Justice. She was its inaugural director before being appointed the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this appointment was in July 2024. I think a small footnote, I think that's kind of partly relevant to today's discussion also, is that I think Iran is one of the highest executing countries when it comes to the death penalty for drug trafficking offenses. Mai's academic research focuses on the death penalty, which she has studied across numerous jurisdictions. In 2014, she published a monograph titled The Death Penalty in Japan, Will the Public Tolerate Abolition? Mai also wrote an extensive review of the studies conducted at a commission by Singapore's Ministry of Home Affairs to justify the death penalty, right, which is titled Singapore's Death Penalty for Drug Trafficking, What the Research Says and Doesn't. And that's published on Academia SG. People can refer to the article if you like, and we'll be discussing some of the studies that Mai reviewed as part of today's discussion. Before we jump into it, maybe just a few housekeeping notes. So first, the format of today's webinar is that we'll have maybe about 45 minutes, an hour conversation with Mai, with a few questions for her, and then we'll jump into Q&A. So for people keen to ask questions, please leave them in the Q&A box. And then we'll kind of pick up the questions in the Q&A section. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can leave your questions there too in the Facebook Live comments, and our Q&A manager will kind of copy paste the questions for us here on Zoom. So we'll be able to get everyone's questions. So a warm welcome, Mai. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Rocky.
Yeah. Thank you for agreeing to do this, especially at
No
this
problem.
hour.
I hope I can stay, coherent.
Okay. Great. So let's start. I think it's good to start to set the context for today's conversation, right? Which is why actually are we talking about deterrence and kind of who talks about deterrence.
Yep. Do you want me to talk about that, Rocky, now, or?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start by saying just a bit about, I think, Singapore and what you've said about at least the fact that Singapore's government is very insistent that the death penalty is an effective deterrent in the war against drugs, right? So I think most recently in the ministerial statement in May, Shanmugam kind of repeated, Minister of Law and Home Affairs, Shanmugam kind of repeated, you know, those things about the death penalty and said the evidence shows that it's necessary to protect our people, prevent the destruction of thousands of families, and prevent the loss of thousands of lives, right? And that's what you said. And this has been a consistent refrain of the Singapore government since the death penalty for drugs was introduced. You know, and it's said many times, you know, because of the finality of the death penalty, it's more feared than imprisonment as a form of punishment. And Singapore also sells its tough approach to drugs in kind of like regional and international forums, such as the ASEAN and the United Nations. So maybe the question for you would be kind of, is this reliance on deterrence to justify the death penalty kind of like a common feature of retentionist regimes, or is Singapore exceptional in that sense? Yeah.
No, I would definitely say Singapore isn't an exception on this. Many retentionist governments refer to the deterrent argument in justifying the retention of the death penalty. So when you look at countries that have ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they need to report to the UN Human Rights Committee on a regular basis. And so the state party report that these governments submit sort of provides justification, what steps have been made to move away from the death penalty or the reasons why they need to retain it. And over the last few years, various countries have submitted their state party reports. But so I've looked at a few over the last sort of few years, like Vietnam, Uganda, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan, all submitted very recently. Vietnam, Uganda didn't talk about deterrence, but Egypt in 2020, Pakistan in 2022, and Iran in 2021, so these are all recent examples when they refer to why they retain a death penalty. They all refer to deterrence in one way or another. Shall I share some examples on how these countries have justified and used deterrence?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So Egypt in 2020, I'm just gonna use the chat function. So these are quotes from the government reports. So this is what Egypt said. In 2 paragraphs, they mention it. So the first one, it says that punishment is basically referring to the death penalty, is surrounded by numerous safeguards in order to balance society's right to public deterrence against the individual's right to life. I haven't really seen the phrase public deterrence, but that may be some translation from Arabic to English. And then the next sentence, it doesn't use the word deterrence, but it's basically pointing to it. The decision to abolish or suspend this penalty should be given to the effect it might have on rates of serious crimes and the security and peace of society. So it's basically linking the death penalty to crime rates and the safety within society. So that, I think, is sort of a classic way in which governments, refer to deterrence. And another example, if I could continue, is from Pakistan in 2022. Here, they're talking about honor killing laws, and it's the last sentence that's relevant, but it says, under this law, this law being the honor killing laws, relatives of the victim would only be able to pardon the killer if he is sentenced to capital punishment. However, the culprit will still face a mandatory life sentence or 12.5 years. This is serving as a strong deterrent against committing crimes in the name of honor. So here, we're not talking about, drug trafficking and death penalty, but still referring to the death penalty as something that works as a deterrent. And then this will be my last example. Iran in 2021. This actually brings a sort of a slightly different perspective, because Iran's talking about justifying public executions. And if you look at the second sentence there, it says, given that some instances of crime or hooliganism leading to murder have severely hurt public sentiment or led to widespread insecurity, the execution of the death penalty in public can have a serious deterrent effect on the occurrences of such crimes. In rare cases, have this punishment carried out publicly. So here, all these sort of 3 examples, they refer to the death penalty, but in slightly different ways, but all talk about, it's for public protection and for public assurance as well, that these crimes are heinous crimes, and then it shouldn't be committed, and that by demonstrating that somehow the public, the would-be offender, will be deterred from committing crimes. So these are some of the examples.
Thanks, Mai. Yeah, I think that's interesting to hear like that phrase public deterrence, because I think that's and the right to deterrence in that sense, like it's kind of like a warped framing to hear in a
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But I think it kind of feels quite resonant in Singapore's context, in the sense that we often talk about deterrence in the terms of like public protection too, and public safety. And this sense that we are a vulnerable country that needs to be protected from drug trafficking, and these drug traffickers are the others who deserve that punishment. So that's shared across different intentions.
Yeah, and these are just examples that I found over the last few years. So if you go back a bit more in time, I'm sure we will have many more examples with different countries, different retentionist countries referring to the death penalty. One thing that I wanted to sort of add is, so, these are the government's positions. What does the sort of the UN say? And UN's position, UN has provided numerous statements, but the famous one, I guess, is the General Comment 36 on the Article 6 of the ICCPR. And in that document, it's not legally binding, but it's authoritative. This is what they said about deterrence. They said, General Comment 36 of the Human Rights Committee said, there is no conclusive evidence of the deterrent value of the death penalty. While some studies suggest a deterrent effect, others find no correlation between the death penalty and homicides rates or find a negative correlation. So that's the sort of the official stance of the UN Human Rights Committee on deterrence, and this has been quoted a lot in their concluding observations and different resolutions.
Thank you. Yeah. So I guess maybe then just to ask why do countries' explanations of or relying on, like, how do countries respond when faced with this, United Nations general comments? Like what generally are their responses to the argument that there's no deterrent effect, or there's no evidence for deterrent effect of the death penalty?
I think the response is usually, or that there is no response, or when there is a response, countries often have their data, and that's often about saying that when in this period when the country didn't have the death penalty, the homicide rates went up by so many percent, or the other way around. And that's not evidence that the death penalty is being effective, or that we draw a causal connection between, let's say, homicide rate and the death penalty. But these are the kind of examples that states often use to claim the deterrent effect of the death penalty.
Thank you. Wanted to shift a bit of tack in terms of talking about another actor in the kind of the legal system, so to speak. I mean, the government decides the laws around the death penalty or around criminal punishment in general. But I mean, often it's the judiciary that's in the position to enforce or think about how these punishments are, what are the sentencing principles in incident cases, what the punishments are. And I think I think maybe in Singapore's context particularly, I think there is a lot of kind of judicial commentary saying that, deterrence is the operative principle driving sentencing decisions for drug offenses in non-death penalty cases, but also when it comes to kind of like constitutional reviews of like laws restraining basic rights, right? For example, the use of like presumptions in law, those things are constitutional. And actually what they often say, it's Parliament's competence, or it's up to the legislature to impose these things because there is the importance, and Parliament has identified the importance of deterrence, right, as a principle underlying the implementation or the introduction of such laws. I guess I wonder if you could kind of comment on that kind of outset.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting that politicians often talk about deterrent effect of punishment, not just the death penalty, but any punishment. If there's a heinous crime and there's public outcry, often the response is that we've made the punishment harsher, therefore more deterrent effect, therefore we're trying to protect society. What's interesting is that, yes, there's a lot of discussion about deterrence by policymakers, in the legislature, and then the judges also, when applying the law, refer to the sort of the motivations behind the law and talk about deterrence in sentencing as well. In the state of Victoria, where I live, sentencing framework refers to deterrence as one of the aims of sentencing. And but what's interesting is that it doesn't really matter whether the legislature believes in the deterrent effect or the judges believe in it, whether its sentencing guidelines refer to deterrence. These are just ideas, and we have actually no way of proving it. So in one way, like, the whole criminal justice system in many countries, with or without the death penalty, it's based on the idea of deterrence. Many sentencing guidelines across the world talk about deterrence. But what we don't know really is whether 3 years of imprisonment deters more than 2 years of imprisonment. We don't have data for that. And the same applies to the death penalty. And I think that's important. But I think there's something in us that intuitively a harsher punishment deters people sort of makes sense. But that doesn't mean that, we can show it with evidence or that's what actually happens.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that I think we have to come back to. Like, I think in some ways
Yeah.
that, like, and we should later on in the conversation about, like, I guess deterrence being also having like a cultural element to it. Like, I think, I think we can say more about that later in the conversation. But maybe to kind of take us there, maybe what we could do is to first kind of go back to basics, right? Which is to ask actually, what do we actually mean by deterrence when governments, policymakers, researchers refer to it, like, and where does the concept of deterrence even come from?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about deterrence, I think we need to divide it into two categories. One is what's often called a specific deterrence or direct deterrence, and the other is general deterrence or indirect deterrence. I'll start with a specific and a direct deterrence. And specific deterrence is basically deterrent effect on the actual individual offender who committed the offense, and you make it impossible for him or her to reoffend. So in some ways, it has sort of incapacitative effect. So specific deterrence of the death penalty, I guess that's sort of obvious that you eliminate that individual from society. Therefore, you've achieved specific deterrence because that individual can no longer reoffend. And one may think that, okay, specific deterrence is, effective in that sense. But the two things, one is that, well, that incapacitative effect could have been achieved by other punishment, like a long-term imprisonment, for example, or taking that. So it doesn't have to be the death penalty. But another point is that in specific deterrence is sort of only effective if we know that only there's a certain number of people who offend. So if we know for sure that there's only, let's say, 100 murderers and 200 traffickers in Singapore, we eliminate these people, then job done, specific deterrence, well executed. But that's not the reality. I mean, if we're just talking about drugs, as long as there's demand for illicit drugs, there will always be groups, individuals supplying. Even if one drug group or syndicate is taken down, that void will be filled with another group. So I think this idea of specific deterrence, working well is faulty in the sense that there will always be offenders. So, but anyway, that's specific or direct deterrence. The second group category is general deterrence. And I think this is what we often mean by deterrence. When we just say deterrence, it's about trying to deter the would-be offenders from committing that crime. So it's about trying to change the motivation of would-be offenders by punishing a certain offender punishing him or her with death penalty or some other punishment. And it's sort of premised on the idea that in our decision-making capacity, we always are rational people and we weigh up the cost and benefits of a particular action. This case will be offending. And then the rational person will think, oh, if the penalty is higher than the benefit, then one would refrain from offending. And so that's the sort of the big assumption posed with general deterrence. And maybe I could go through what's wrong with this sort of assumption, because in order for general deterrence to actually work, this would-be offender needs to have knowledge the type of thinking and the type of analysis that they could do. So there's various steps. So first, I would say, in order for the general deterrence model to actually work, the would-be offender first have knowledge of the punishment assigned to the offense. So maybe many people know that certain drugs are illicit and they're criminalized, but I don't know if they are able to sort of differentiate between drug offenses that carry the death penalty, how many grams of heroin, for example, is the capital threshold. Or they may not know the factual and the legal requirements, necessary to prove these offenses. So that's the first assumption. This would-be offender needs to be pretty knowledgeable about the punishment to the offense. And then the second is often referred to as the certainty principle. This would-be offender must have some sense of the certainty of the punishment, and this can't be negligible. But, estimating the odds of being executed or being sentenced to death is actually pretty complicated, because the would-be offender needs to be able to think about the likelihood of being caught by the police, and then the likelihood of being charged, prosecuted, convicted, sentenced to death, and then that sentence being confirmed on appeal, and then followed by the likelihood of execution. So it's when I think in the sort of case of Singapore, often like the Singapore's mandatory death penalty is sort of discussed in terms of their certainty of punishment. I think there's a lot more steps before that about the perception of being caught by the police, all of the steps that I've mentioned. But anyway, that's the second steps. The first is about having knowledge about the offense and the punishment. Second is about the certainty of punishment. And then the third, I think that this person acts rationally based on knowledge of the first and the second. Because just because you're very knowledgeable, you're able to sort of, calculate the odds and foresee what may or may not happen. If someone is like, acting in anger or fear or under the influence of substance, or any of the situations where rational thinking's out of the window, then having knowledge and being able to think doesn't really matter. So for some, if they might have knowledge, they might think that yes, I might get caught, but they might act in sort of an emotional state, or they're coerced to do something that it doesn't matter whether you know about your circumstances or not.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's useful to point too, because I think often in the context that we work, and when we work with families and the people in death row, we do hear a lot about coercion, a lot about precarity that drives them to end up drug trafficking, right? Or to try and bring drugs across the border, for example, from Malaysia to Singapore. And it feels like those things are kind of what drives decision making, rather than knowledge of the offense or
Yeah.
any kind of
Certainty of punishment. Yeah.
and it feels quite it feels as if like this kind of rational choice approach, like it places a very high expectation on people to kind of make decisions along those very specific logical pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the model of deterrence, applies to across offenses. But, when you think about, if you, for example, compare murder and drug trafficking, I think the motivation behind that offending or circumstances behind offending is like really different. Like murder, I'm sure many people know this, often happen within people that you know very well, families, relatives. It's a very emotive, emotion plays a big part in that. And then drug trafficking, I don't think it's so much about emotion, but as you were talking about coercion, right? Or then some people may be threatened or coerced to traffic drugs. Some people may not even know, right, that they're carrying drugs with them in a suitcase or carrying something for a friend. Or all these sort of motivations behind offending, opportunities for offending vary significantly, but applying the sort of the very the same theory of deterrence to all of these offenses really ignores the motivations behind, as well as the sort of the steps required for the general deterrence model to work.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the point about you were saying something about the difference between deterrence in kind of murder cases and drug cases. I think to me, like deterrence in kind of homicide cases seems like in the sense that we obviously both don't think we can reach the conclusion that death penalty has a deterrent effect on murder or homicide cases, right? But at least that logical pathway to that is obvious, even if wrong. But I think in the case of drug trafficking, I think it seems to me that it's often quite slippery. Like what we are trying to or when the government says yes, the death penalty has a deterrent effect on drug trafficking, it's quite a slippery kind of concept, right? In the sense that, are you trying to deter someone from bringing in drugs, like a specific individual from bringing drugs? Are you trying to deter or are you trying to kind of shrink the drug market as a whole? Are you trying to deter the effects of drug use on people, right? Because I think if you go by the government's logic, it's about preventing destruction of families, preventing the loss of lives, and those are things that seem to carry no logical connection with trying to stop the supply, right? I mean, if you want to stop or if you want to ameliorate the harms of use, then you should be providing healthcare. You should be taking a harm reduction approach. So there seems to be no logical connection between the death penalty for drug trafficking and stopping the ills or the harms of drug use in society, right? Or addressing the harms
Yeah, I guess if I'm trying to apply the flawed narrative to justify, drug trafficking and the death penalty using deterrence, maybe I could do it by using both specific and general deterrence. Like specific could be that you sort of deter the individual trafficker. Therefore, you're trying to shrink the drug market, but we both know that's faulty because that shrunk market would be filled with other offenders, who come in. And in terms of the general deterrence, if we look at the motivations behind people, I think we look at that in some of the studies that we might talk about later on. But the general deterrence model is unlikely to apply in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of this rational thinking.
Thank you. Yeah.
Rocky, I'm curious to say why do you think you intuitively get the deterrence argument for murder?
No, in the sense that it seems at least the target is clear, or at least what the claim is clear, in the sense that they are trying to stop. I definitely don't agree with it. I'm just saying that what I'm trying to say is that I think the claim is clearer about you are trying to deter a specific individual from committing murder. At least that logic is clearer, from the government. Yeah, I don't think I don't agree with the conclusion in that sense.
Yeah, or that if it's general deterrence, you're trying to deter the would-be murderer from committing murder, not a specific individual.
Yeah. So I think along those lines, I wanted to ask you then, I guess the next part is to how actually do researchers or governments try to measure the deterrent effect? What kind of studies or research are out there, and what are the issues with it? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So there's different types of studies. I'll say there's probably 3 types of studies. One is people's views on deterrence. And I think the Singapore government has done several studies of this nature. So it's about asking the public, do you think people will be deterred from drug trafficking, there's death penalty, or so you ask what people think about this topic. And I mean, to put it very bluntly, it really doesn't matter what the public think about the deterrent effect, because it really isn't a matter of opinion. It's whether it actually deters or not. So, but we can, if we have time, we can have a look at how some of these studies have been carried out and used as evidence to show. So just because public thinks that, death penalty deters, let's say 80% of the people think death penalty deters drug trafficking, that's just their opinion. It's very different from whether it actually deters. So that's one type of study. And another type is to compare two regions or similar countries. So in the US, you have states with the death penalty, states without. There are some studies that says, to assume that these two countries or states could be compared and to see the difference in homicide rates or other offenses. Often the studies are about homicide rates. And then if we want an example from Asia, I believe David Johnson has written a study about comparing Singapore and Hong Kong. They're again assuming that these two places could be compared. So one problem with that is there's a big if in comparing the two countries or two cities, because we need to make sure that these two places are comparable. And often they're not, because they're in different geographical areas, maybe different, political parties. So we don't know what's influencing what. So unless we know that two places are almost identical, can be compared, these studies are flawed in that way. And another thing, another type of deterrent study, there's a before and after design. So if a country had a period where there was no death penalty or death penalty was abolished or reintroduced, you compare the different time points to say homicide rate has gone up, after abolition of the death penalty, or gone down after abolition of the death penalty, and to show some link. So this kind of study actually doesn't prove deterrent effect. At most, they might show correlation, but not causation. Correlation simply means that two things, in this case, death penalty and homicide rates, are somehow associated, but it doesn't say one causes the other. So it might move in similar directions or in opposite directions, but it doesn't mean that one is causing the other. And also these studies often really don't talk about whether the same effect could be achieved by a different punishment other than the death penalty. I wanted to share a link with everyone. I really love this website, which sort of, I'm gonna share two examples here in the chat, just to demonstrate the difference between correlation and causation. And so these are all the examples of correlation. So you may, if you click on any of these graphs, you may think that two variables are very much, correlated, but they probably have nothing to do with each other. And so one is about the, first name Stevie correlating with Lululemon stock price, and the other is degrees awarded in liberal arts correlating perfectly with the Google search for tummy ache. So these are very extreme examples, but sometimes when deterrent studies on the death penalty are published, this is what they're basically doing. Look at these two variables, use of the death penalty in homicides, look how it correlates. We just don't know whether one is causing the other, or whether a third variable is influencing something, or that they don't really have anything to do with each other, but it just looks like they're mirroring each other. So those are the three types of studies looking at the deterrent effect. And if you really want to prove causation, we need to have a sort of a social experiment. We create two identical cities in terms of demographics and politics, everything, and then we have in one city with the death penalty, in one city maybe another sort of punishment, let's say life imprisonment without parole. but there's no way we can do this sort of experiment. So at best, it's all observational data, and at best, it's sort of correlation that we can discuss.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. I think what I'm hearing is that, at a fundamental level, you can't actually prove or really disprove the effect of the death penalty. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one study that I think is a really good study, which I'll share in the chat as well. This was done by the United States National Academies of Science. And what they did is they didn't sort of do a whole new deterrence study. What they did is they reviewed all available US studies undertaken on this topic since 1978. And, this is what they concluded. They said, this is a quote, I'll just read out. The committee concludes that research to date on the effect of capital punishment on homicide is not informative about whether capital punishment decreases, increases, or has no effect on homicides rates. Therefore, the committee recommends that these studies not to be used to inform deliberations requiring judgments about the effect of the death penalty on homicide. Consequently, claims that research demonstrates that capital punishment decreases or increases the homicide rates by a specific amount has no effect on the homicide rate should not influence policy judgments about capital punishment. So I thought that was quite a good quote summarizing the state of deterrence studies.
Great, thank you. So I think at this point we can kind of jump into the specific studies that the Ministry of Home Affairs cites or our ministers rely on in talking about deterrence or trying to show that deterrence, like the death penalty, has a deterrent effect. I think last year in October you published this article in Academia SG, and there was a attached appendix to it as well. And you reviewed 6 studies that were basically all of them were conducted by the ministry. One by the Institute of Policy Studies. 3 of those studies were about public opinion. One was about kind of like the perception of Singapore's crime situation by people in neighboring countries. And then 2 of which are kind of more specifically about deterrence. So before we jump to the kind of details, I understand as part of the process, you first reached out to the ministry to ask for the data set relating to the study, right? And they didn't give it to you. Maybe you could say like what you would have done with the data and maybe what we should make out of the absence of that data, right? I mean, not just that they didn't give it to you specifically, but that it's not like, the kind of disaggregated data is not generally available.
Yeah, absolutely. So I noticed in newspaper articles, often there's quotes about this study showed this and this study showed this. And I thought, well, where are these studies? So I wrote to the Ministry of Home Affairs requesting where can I read up on these studies. And I think they magically appeared, the reports appeared online. And so I got a link. And then I followed up to say, well, may I have the access to anonymized raw data set, because there were several public opinion studies, but that was a no. So that ruled out the possibility of, Rocky, as you said, doing secondary analysis. Secondary analysis is important in a sense that you can verify the analysis carried out by the author. So it has a sort of a check sort of function. But secondary analysis also allows you to do different analysis to what the authors have done in interrogating the data. So one example is that the 3 studies on Singaporeans' attitude to the death penalty, the main questions about the support to the death penalty or their belief in deterrence, they use 5-point Likert scale question, which is about, very much agree or agree, somewhat not sure, and then sort of disagree, definitely disagree. So the attitude is sort of divided in this 5-point scale. what's often quoted in the media, if we use the example of support for the death penalty, are those who strongly agree and agree combined. And without the raw data set, and if it's not reported in the paper, you can't disaggregate, well, who were the people who strongly supported the death penalty or strongly thought that there was deterrent effect. We don't know the people who thought, well, maybe I support the death penalty to a certain extent, or maybe there's deterrence effect. So, those are the kind of analysis that you can do, but this is a very sort of a simple example. But I thought it would be interesting to be able to look at correlations. For example, if there were some questions in the survey that asked about people's knowledge on the death penalty, I would have tried to not just analyze, to what extent people knew about the death penalty, but actually link it to, so people who, were less knowledgeable, were they more likely to support the death penalty or not? So these are the kinds of analysis that you could have done if you had access to the anonymized data set.
Thanks, Mai. Yeah. So jumping to the studies, maybe we could start with the one that says the impact of deterrence on the decision-making process of drug traffickers. So that's study 5. A study done by the home team, basically by the ministry research and statistics.
Internal researchers, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a study that has 2 parts to it, right? One is that they interviewed individuals convicted of drug trafficking, 22 of them, and held focus group discussions about their perceptions of risk. To understand, to be the first part of the study, and second, they kind of did a survey of 300 prisoners, 300 male Singaporeans who were admitted to prisons, about half for drug trafficking offences and the other half for other kinds of offences. And the study basically tries to paint a picture that people do consider the risk, or do consider, kind of like rationally consider what the risks are when committing an offense. So if you could kind of share your insight about that study.
Yeah, this is a very interesting study, and I was actually surprised that this was published, because when I was reading the study, I thought the findings actually showed that these drug traffickers, these offenders, didn't really apply their rational thinking, so thereby going against the deterrence model. So to use an example from the qualitative part of the study, I think they did interviews, I think with 22 people, 22 individuals convicted of drug trafficking, and also with 28 offenders convicted of various offenses, not limited to drug trafficking. They did some sort of like a group discussion or a focus group type discussion. And there's I think maybe we can share the findings online. Trying to see which page. Okay, do you know there's there's a page on the findings where people say why they sort of what were the sort of circumstances that led to them offending, getting caught. And one of the interviewees says, I never once think about getting caught because I really do it safe. Yeah. When the money keeps coming in, then you see the money at present time, fear go away. So these are some of the examples from the quotes that's being published. And even just those 2, examples, it shows that rational thinking wasn't applied here. And so it really very much goes against sort of the idea that, how general deterrence model needs to work. You need to have rational people weighing up the costs. And I think one of the findings in this article, I think it concludes that groups who had longer sentences so committing more serious offenses had higher levels of impulsivity as compared to those who didn't traffic drugs. So here, the study also confirms that, impulsivity, i.e. not rational thinking, is one of the sort of motivations and the circumstances that led to their offending. So I thought that was very interesting. Rocky, were you going to say something?
No, I think I think it's quite clear that it's not the same conclusions they want to draw on the study. That one
Yeah.
side of the effect of effect of sanctions on like offenses. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the phase 2 of the study, which is supposed to be the quantitative study, this for me was very difficult to interpret because none of the variables listed, it shows how it was coded. And also the questionnaire used in the phase 2 isn't made available in the study, which sort of violates many of the sort of reporting requirements needed to publish these findings. So I'm not sure I have a lot to say on this, but I don't think either phase 1, phase 2 says a lot that shows about the rational decision-making sort of model. Phase 1, for sure, I think goes against sort of the rationale.
Right. So you're saying that by MHA's own study that actually kind of disproves that
Yeah, exactly. There is one question in the chat, but on the secondary data, but do we wait until the end?
Yeah, I think we can take it.
Yeah. So there's a question about secondary data. If do other governments release this data for studies? So it's a question about whether secondary data is made available in other countries. So for example, the UK, for example, carries out various, public opinion surveys as well as victim studies, self-reported victimization studies, and all the data sets are uploaded on UK data archive for researchers to analyze. But UK is the country without the death penalty. But in terms of governments making anonymized raw data available, yes, it's not an uncommon thing. In terms of retentionist governments releasing data, Singapore is unique in the sense that Singapore carries out sort of research and also commissions research on this topic. So I don't think I have another country to compare. The only comparison I can think of is the Japanese government. Japanese government carries out a public opinion survey every 5 years, and they publish the results. They didn't used to publish or share raw data, but they have shared raw data with the Japan Federation of Bar Associations, and I managed to receive the data set and do some analysis. So in the case of Japan, the raw data isn't uploaded in any public database, but with the Freedom of Information request, they did release it. So those would be the examples.
Yeah, thanks, Mai, for taking that question. Yeah. Yeah. So should we then cover the next study then? If you have
Yeah, of course.
said quite a fair bit about this study. And the other study that we wanted to talk about was the one on deterrent effect of historical amendments to Singapore sanction. That's page 56 to 64 of the link to the Home Team journal that's now been posted in the chat for everyone. And that's kind of like a more classic, I guess you were mentioning the type of study that compares before and after the introduction of the death penalty. In this case for cannabis and for opium trafficking. And looks at the 4-year periods before and after the introduction. Yeah.
Exactly, but it tries to use heroin trafficking as a control group, which I'm puzzled by the choice of the control group, but that's what they used as a control. Would it be useful to explain sort of why there's a control group and the sort of the method, or is that too in detail?
Yeah, you could give us like kind of a simple summary of like the approach.
Yeah, of course, of course. So this is sort of a before and after study. So as Rocky was saying, using the example of cannabis trafficking, I think cannabis trafficking was made into mandatory death penalty in, is it 1990? So they wanted to see the effect of that. So it's comparing 2 years before and I think 2 years after of this window, I think. But just because, let's say, assuming that there's a drop in these cases, drug trafficking of cannabis after the mandatory death penalty was introduced, it could be caused by other factors. So in this case, they're trying to use a control. So the control here, I'm not sure why, but it's heroin trafficking cases. So whatever change that was being made in the sort of in drug policy would be captured in the heroin cases. So let's say in the heroin trafficking cases, it was also showing a decline. Then the effect of the mandatory death penalty law may be more limited because there was an overall reduction in the trafficking cases. So here, the heroin trafficking case is used as a control to sort of showcase and to kind of calculate what were the other things happening around this time. But there's a big if on, is heroin trafficking the correct sort of control group to have?
Yeah. In terms of the conclusions of that study, I think something stood out, right? So one is the fact that actually there wasn't a reduction in the number of people trafficking in whether in the kind of cannabis case or the opium case, right? They were saying in the study. And also the other thing that it pointed to was actually in terms of cannabis, it said there was actually no kind of statistically significant effect in terms of the reduction of the amount of cannabis traffic.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, earlier I think I made a mistake. I said 2 years before the amendment and 2 years after. It's actually 4-year window before the amendment and 4-year window after the amendment. But yeah, you're right. I think the number of individuals who traffic cannabis 4 years prior to the amendment, 4 years after, no difference. And I think proportion of individuals who traffic more than 500 grams of cannabis, there was a difference between the two periods, 1 percentage point reduction. And then the weight trafficked decreased by 400 grams also. But again, we're just looking at sort of one drug, one time point. So we don't know what is causing the sort of the 400-gram difference. But yeah, you're absolutely right that on cannabis, yeah, there's a very little change.
Right. So one thing that the government, at least the minister, likes to quote, and I think it's kind of quite crucial to tackle head on, right? I think when referencing the study, he often says that after the death penalty was introduced for trafficking for opium, for more than 1.2 kilograms of opium in 1990, he says that there's a referencing to the weight of opium traffic, there was a 66% reduction in the average net weight of opium traffic in the 4 years that follow. I guess what conclusions do you draw from the study about that, or what conclusions should we not draw about that particular statistic? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear from this that there is a reduction, but I'm wondering whether the reduction is due to the 1990 amendment or whether something else is causing the reduction. Maybe other drugs became more in fashion, and that generally speaking, the amount of opium available in the broader drug market has also shrunk, and that's just reflecting that. Or, of course, it could be that, it could be that because of the change in amendment, drug traffickers were more careful about the amount. But this study only shows the average net weight trafficked. It doesn't really show sort of to how the sort of each case was sort of distributed. So were there some cases, was there an increase in the number of drug trafficking for opium that was just below the capital threshold? I think for opium, is it 1.2 kilograms? I think. So, was there an increase? That's what I would sort of look at, not show the average net weight, because we don't know how the sort of the data's dispersed. And so that's one thing I will say about the average net weight. What was interesting for the opium is that actually the number of individuals who trafficked opium increased right after the amendment. But it could be that they were all individually carrying less, amount of opium. So these are the different conclusions that could be drawn. I wouldn't sort of go straight to the conclusion that, the reduction in the average net weight trafficked can be, traced back to making this mandatory death penalty offense.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to kind of point to kind of something. I think what kind of sits quite uncomfortably about the way these studies are used or referenced is also the fact that like this is data dependent on like arrests, right? And what what the amount of policing there is, right? And it does not strike me that I think and maybe in your experience you could share like where that's reliable data to talk about the size or the scope of the drug market in the first instance. And because if you look at kind of like CNB data around drug trafficking in Singapore, drug seizures in Singapore, it kind of varies. I mean, overall, there's no trend of decline, it seems, but overall, it just seems it varies from year to year depending on who they happen to arrest or what drug busts happen, who gets arrested. So like, how can it be a reliable basis to say, there is an effect of the death penalty on
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, this is, this study seeks enforcement data, right? So it certainly isn't a true picture of what was happening in the overall sort of drug market. And as you rightly point out, it could be that there were differences in police enforcement. So all these things could have happened. It could have been just the overall change in the market, nothing to do with the amendment. It could have been the result of different policing tactics and policing strategies. So all of these things could have influenced this. So by looking at the data and the tables presented, I would certainly not sort of go to the conclusion that, a reduction in the average net weight trafficked for opium is because of, is caused by the 1990 amendment. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Mai. Yeah, I'm a bit conscious of time, so maybe I think we just move quickly into our last section of kind of like discussion, the last question I had for you before we open up to the floor. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, I think overall the picture that you have painted and we kind of share is that really there isn't evidence for the deterrent effect of the death penalty, right? So what in your view, in your experience, kind of explains the resilience of it, right, as a defense for the death penalty, despite the and how can we move on or move away from that? Yeah.
I don't know if I have a good answer for the latter part, but in terms of, the resilience and the sort of the attractiveness of the deterrence argument, I've already touched on this sort of earlier, but, a whole criminal justice system, not just the countries with the death penalty, it is kind of partly built on the idea of deterrence. I use the example of where I live in the state of Victoria. Deterrence is, mentioned as one of the theories, for punishment. And, UN, even though they have the, General Comment 36, their famous comment on deterrence, when you see recommendations made to each state, for example, by the UN Human Rights Committee, they sometimes use phrase like, make sure that, offenders receive, adequate and deterrent punishment. And so here, people still believe that, in the deterrent effect of maybe not just death penalty, but punishment, generally speaking. So in countries where there is a death penalty, that's the most severe punishment. So of course, people will be using the deterrence argument, no matter faulty. But at the same time, our justice system is based on that idea, partly based on that idea. But if we actually sort of strip it down and think, well, if empirically speaking, deterrence shouldn't be used to justify the death penalty, the only kind of justification, in my view, remains is that the death penalty is there for retributive justice grounds, that, a state chooses to kill based on what was done, committed, and that it's not about sort of a benefit to society such as deterrence, or it's not about rehabilitation. It's because it cares only about what was done in the past, the offense, and these states think that the appropriate proportionate punishment is death. And then these states are probably in this way, willing to be okay with making mistakes, because every system will make mistakes, so they need to be comfortable with wrongful executions. But I think deterrence just gives a sort of a nice justification to say that we don't like to kill, but we care a lot about public safety. This is why we need the death penalty. But if we strip that sort of justification away, what's left is a justice system where state wants to kill based on what was done, nothing to do with, benefits to the broader society. So yeah, I think the deterrence argument, it's powerful because many criminal justice systems rely on that argument, and the legislature, the judiciary use it. So it doesn't really give a sort of a solution or going beyond it. But yeah, that's what I was thinking when you posted that question. But I don't know, in terms of Singapore, I feel like broader drug policy also needs to shift, and that's also difficult too, because even the UN conventions, the main conventions, sort of promotes sort of the enforcement-based approach as well. And even though there's been shifts, UN agencies like UNODC often don't make statements about when there has been an execution for death penalty offenses. So in that sense, I think it's difficult, but I think it's about deterrence, drug policy. That's sort of key, isn't it, in the Singapore context. But I don't know how we can sort of move away from that narrative.
But I think what you said is helpful in the sense that I think when you say that if you strip away deterrence because it just doesn't work, right? And you're left with retribution, I think that's something. I think when confronted with, we are more likely, it's more easy to realize the moral horror, right, of the death penalty and what it costs to people and communities. So I think on that note, shall we open to the floor for questions? You can write them in the chat again. Or if you have a question that you'd like to ask through the webinar, please just raise your hand. Yes.
I will just point out that I am here as an academic based at Monash University and an expert on the death penalty. I am not here today as a UN Special Rapporteur in Iran, so I will not be answering questions on those points.
Thank you, Mai. Okay. I see a hand from Koki. Do you want to start? Yes, if
Hi, Mai.
Hi, Koki.
How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you? Good to hear your voice.
Yeah, thanks for doing this today. I just wanted to sort of, I guess, like kind of respond to some things in the discussion more than have a question. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think like so I think one thing is like this whole question of like rational decision making, right? And I think like what's often missed is the fact that people make decisions in very different circumstances, right? And it's still like I think what's rational for like a poor person who's desperate and like maybe has like a parent in the hospital and they need to pay um the hospital fees to get them surgery, and so like deciding to like traffic drugs to do that can still be a wholly rational decision. And I think like sometimes the framing, I mean I want to hear your thoughts on this, but sometimes I think the framing of like, oh, people these laws are made on the basis that, or on the assumption that people make rational decisions, but people don't always. I think people can still make very rational decisions, just that may not be as legible or like to a middle class sensibility or people who are not in like desperate situations, but it's actually wholly rational for the person in that desperate situation, right? And so it's not maybe only just that some people make decisions emotionally and others rationally, but that what is rational changes based on people's material conditions and circumstances too, right? So I think that's one thing I was wondering if you could like get what your thoughts were on. And yeah, I think I also just wanted to point to like how the harsher the punishment, I mean, like there's the understanding of like deterrence is based on the idea that like harsher the punishment, then the more there's deterrence. But I think what it obfuscates is also that the harsher the punishment, the harsher the exploitation in the drug trade, right? That like there's more deception of like people who may know the law and be afraid of it, and then the many like kinds of ways that people are coerced or deceived can also intensify with the harshness of punishments. And I was wondering if you could comment on that too. Okay. Yeah, and I think also, so sorry, finally, I think that sometimes when we point to these studies on like the how there's no conclusive evidence of deterrent effect, then people like challenge that sometimes by saying then, oh, but there's no conclusive evidence that like it doesn't either, and it's like commonsensical that there is deterrence. We don't need to be able to prove it. We all know it intuitively, like you said at the beginning. And I think maybe it's helpful to emphasize I think the premise of having a conversation like this is that the burden, when you want to make like such a violent choice to take someone's life, then the burden should be on the people making that decision to prove it. And that should be very high standards, right, to that proof, as opposed to that, oh, like as long as there's no evidence that it's not a deterrent, it's fine to go ahead and kill people. So yeah, just okay, I will stop talking now. Thank you.
Thanks. All those 3 points, I agree with you in terms of the rational thinking. I think we discussed this earlier on in this event about there's different motivations and circumstances for people to offend, and we talked about differences in like murder cases and drug trafficking, but I really liked how you sort of phrased it that maybe it's rational for everyone, just circumstances are different, and what is rational to them, it may be different to another person's rational behavior, and it sort of assumes a person who is in a good financial situation with good social capital and education. And I think that's a really clever and a good way of describing it. I think I was making the same point by saying that the rational weighing up the costs, there are also other factors like coercion or not even knowing that they were in the position to make that rational choice. If, for example, if they didn't even know that they were carrying drugs in their suitcase, for example. So I definitely agree with the point about rationality, and I think that was the first point. In terms of the harsher punishment coming with harsher exploitation, I think that's definitely true. From the basic sort of premise of when you criminalize drugs, it goes to sort of, the black market, and that will come with certain risks. And if the punishment is harsher, often the drugs also get stronger too, so that it doesn't occupy as much space. And then those who will be willing to take the risk or being in a position where they have to take the risk are those who will be more vulnerable. So I definitely agree with harsher penalties comes with more exploitation. And when looking at who are the people who are being coerced or willing to make that decision to take that risk. In terms of the third point about many of us intuitively think that there's a deterrent effect to a harsh punishment, including the death penalty. I think if I could refer back to the quote that I shared from the US study where they did a systematic review, they also came to the same conclusion as you, Kokila, saying that if a policy decision is going to be made based on deterrence, then they shouldn't be making it on the basis of deterrence because there isn't, enough evidence to support it. And I think that applies also in the case of Singapore. So much, is said about, it relies on the deterrent effect of the death penalty, and the studies currently carried out and published do not point to that. So I would argue that the evidence shows we don't have enough evidence to use to justify the death penalty on the basis of its deterrent effect in Singapore.
Okay, shall we take another question from
Yeah, there's one on Malaysia, which I think is there one or, oh, sorry, maybe we're looking at different places.
Yeah, there is. It's quite brief. It just says Malaysia experience. I suppose the question is about whether it's been research or studies in Malaysia, and I guess, yeah, actually not very clear what the question is about.
I mean, I think one thing I sort of came to mind when I sort of read that sentence was I think the developments in the region, I think, will definitely have an impact in the future on the Singapore's death penalty, I think, because there's so many sort of psychological studies comparing what kind of norms influence people to change. And there's studies about, sort of injunctive norms and descriptive norms. And injunctive mean like, the morals or what is right and what is wrong. And then descriptive meaning that, what do the others are doing. And it's the latter that really impacts people's decision, not so much the norms and the morals. And I think, Malaysia's, move away from the mandatory death penalty, could definitely have a knock-on effect on Singapore developments in Thailand. And I think it's not true that some countries or Singapore don't pay attention or don't care about what the other countries are doing. I think we do. And when you look at the map of, death penalty states, those with and without, it's very regional. And I think it's got to do with, looking at, being influenced and being aware of what the region is doing. So any positive developments in the region, I think in the mid to long term, will have a knock-on effect on the Singapore's death penalty policy for sure. I think.
Certainly hope so too. Yeah. Yeah. There's another question in the Q&A box. The first one that says, does no conclusive evidence means the states can impose the death penalty if the United Nations stands on the fence? And whether the absence of data gives states leeway or doesn't to impose the death penalty. I suppose that's both and can
Yeah. So I think there is academic consensus that it's impossible to prove, whether the death penalty deters or not. And I think that if you want to retain the death penalty based on the basis of deterrence, you want to be able to show that death penalty deters. So the lack of evidence doesn't mean that it gives justification to states. I think it's the opposite. I hope I answered.
Yes, you have, yeah. There's another raised.
There's someone raising a hand, yeah.
Thing. Eliza has raised her hand. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm on public transport. Okay, so I just want to qualify this by saying I really appreciate Dr. or Professor Mai Sato for the hard work she's put in to these studies. And I'm not an expert in this matter, but so I'm just asking these questions from my personal experience and my own viewpoint. Yeah. So you're saying that there's no deterrence, but I mean, personally, I have been deterred by Haflas from taking and trafficking drugs. So, and I have seen other accounts, I have read other people saying they were deterred. So are you saying, okay, just talking about me, are you saying, is your argument that I'm imagining the personal deterrent effect? Or are you saying I'm dishonest? Or what is your stance? Second question is it your stance that laws do not have a deterrent effect? Even Rocky can see the logic in the deterrent effect of the death penalty for murder, and then he qualifies it. So I'm not sure. And then the third point would be TJC tends to make the point that lawyers are deterred from taking up death penalty cases because of the laws. So it seems quite contradictory, and that to say that some laws have a deterrent effect and some laws don't. So I'm a bit confused. It seems contradictory and a bit of groupthink, if I'm being honest. Yeah. Sorry if that offends. I'm just trying to understand. Thanks.
That's okay. So 3 questions. I'll try to answer one by one. So Eliza, I think you were telling me that you've been deterred from committing drug trafficking. Is that right? I hope I haven't misquoted you. So am I right in understanding?
Yes, that's right. Yes,
so you
were
right. Tempted to traffic drugs?
In general, I'm deterred from taking and trafficking and doing all kinds of other crimes because of the harsh laws in Singapore.
Okay, well, this surprises me because you might be in a minority. Majority of people, I think, don't offend, don't murder, don't traffic because they agree with the law, not because they are deterred by the law. Because what you're actually telling me is that if there wasn't harsh punishment, you will kill and that you will traffic drugs. Is that what you're saying?
It seems a bit contradictory to make the point that lawyers in Singapore are deterred from defending death penalty cases, and then saying that, oh, it's because, it can't work both ways, right?
I thought we were discussing about your.
I'm talking about deterrence,
deterred?
the deterrence of laws, the deterrent effect of laws. So it seems that TGC and friends tend to think that deterrence works for some laws and not other laws.
So I think we've now moved on to the second point that you were making, which is a more general point about laws, do they have deterrent effect or not? So I think there's no point in way to prove it. That's the point that I'm trying to say. We intuitively think that, harsher penalties may deter more than a lesser penalty, but we can't empirically prove it. And this is the sort of the uncomfortable truth, because the criminal justice system, in terms of the harshness of punishment, is sort of based on that assumption. And then regarding the final point about the lawyers are deterred from representing those who are facing the death penalty, I think we're no longer then talking about the deterrent effect of laws or capital laws, but maybe I've misunderstood. Rocky, do you want to come into this?
Yeah, I think that's quite a different kettle of fish, in the sense that I think in the case of lawyers, I think what has been clearly borne out to us, like from our own experience speaking to lawyers and asking lawyers to take up cases, is about the clear implications working in this authoritarian environment and within and against the establishment to represent prisoners in late-stage applications. I think that's what she's referring to. I think that's borne out in our experience, kind of speaking to lawyers. And I think it's quite different in like, to say, I actually don't think it's comparing apples with apples, right? I think these are very different. We're talking about the implications of criminal justice system and criminal legal process, which are huge, complex mechanisms, to clear provisions that say, look, if you're a lawyer, like, and provisions in the law, but also pressure from the establishment not to take up cases. I think those are two very different kettles of fish that are not quite comparable in the same sense. So I don't really get the argument that, this is a contradiction. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, are there any other questions that people like place in the chat? If not, we come to a close in about 5 minutes. Yeah. Actually, I think while we're at it, I just maybe if we could go back to kind of an earlier point, when we were discussing the kind of studies. I think you said something to the effect that it's quite exceptional that Singapore as a country invests resources, right, in kind of like commissioning these studies, hiring researchers, to kind of carry out this research. And you have pointed to a lot of issues with the way the research has been done, or been written, or how the findings, whether the findings don't match up to the data, or that there are methodological issues with how the research is conducted. I think what does that, I guess to me, it reflects a certain kind of, maybe a two-part question, right? To me, it reflects a kind of certain anxiety around the defensibility of the death penalty. And yeah, just trying every means to try and justify it, right? I think that's one, and whether you think that that's the case. And second, like, I think on a broader point, how is it, I mean, it seems to me fundamentally an issue that we rely on evidence from governments, or governments self-produce evidence around something that at least I think in Singapore's case, like, they quite clearly have a vested interest and ideological interest in the death penalty. So I just hoping you could comment on both those things. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right about the fact that, conducting these studies, it's that the government conducts these studies to showcase that there is deterrent effect of the death penalty. It's very unique, it's interesting that you say that it's about showcases a level of anxiety. I think what I would add to that is, I think people tend to trust data when it's being sort of labeled as research, and especially if it's been, commissioned to a research institute, for example, and written up as research findings. And I think, but what I found with these studies is that you scratch the surface and then you see a lot of issues with either how the data is collected or the assumptions made in analyzing the data or the analysis. And so in some ways, yes, when you present it as research findings, it looks like the government's invested. They really want to find out if there's deterrent effect or not and present the findings. I think that's the kind of the presentation made. But I think when you actually look into it in more detail, it actually shows the opposite, that, consistent with the US, reviews carried out, that we can't really say that there's deterrent effect. So it shows a level of commitment, and maybe we can phrase it as it's a level of anxiety shown. But I think this is actually, good result. It's the fact that, it's actually the Singaporean government's own findings don't actually show that there is deterrent effect of the death penalty. And that will give, enough evidence to move on, as you were saying in your last question about how to move on. Well, these studies have been done. I don't think it shows conclusively. So we need to think, beyond deterrence now, on Singapore and the death penalty.
Thank you, Mai. Yeah, I think I guess we can end on that note. I think just to say thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Mai, for sharing kind of your views and taking us through the research. We kind of have 2 more events coming up this Sunday. If you're in Singapore, you can attend them. They'll be in person. So that's Sunday 20th at Ultra Super New Gallery. So it's from 1:30 to 3:30. There'll be a panel on censorship and the death penalty. And from 4, we'll be talking about how to carry forward demands for a moratorium for the death penalty. And you'll also be hearing from advocates for the abolition of death penalty from past and present. So once again, thank you everyone for coming today. That would be the end of our webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.